The roar of the engines was deafening. Nia Carter gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles pale against her sun-bronzed skin. Around her, panicked voices rose like a crescendo, a cacophony of prayers, curses, and guttural cries. The plane shuddered violently, plunging through thick, roiling clouds. "Brace! Brace for impact!" The flight attendant screamed, her voice cracking with fear. The world seemed to implode into a blur of motion and sound. Nia's stomach lurched as the nose of the aircraft dipped. A metallic screech tore through the cabin, a sound so primal it sliced through the chaos like a razor. Time splintered, seconds stretched into eternities. Then the impact. The world went black. When Nia awoke, her head throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. She was sprawled across a patch of uneven ground, her clothes damp with dew and streaked with blood. The acrid stench of smoke filled her nostrils, and the distant crackle of fire punctuated the eerie silence of the jungle. She blinked, disoriented. The wreckage of the plane loomed nearby, a jagged monstrosity of twisted metal and broken dreams. Stray luggage lay scattered like breadcrumbs, torn open to spill their contents. Clothes, papers, a child's toy rabbit. A moan drew her attention. A man was slumped against a tree trunk, clutching his leg. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage he had fashioned from a strip of his shirt. "Hey!" Nia rasped, her voice hoarse. She staggered to her feet and stumbled toward him. "You? What's your name?" "Owen," he groaned, his glasses askew on his sweat-slick face. "Dr. Owen Mathers." "I'm Nia." She crouched beside him, assessing his injury. "Can you move?" "Not easily." His lips pressed into a grim line. "Stay put. I'll see if there's anyone else." The crash site was a surreal tableau of life and death. Survivors staggered about in shock, their faces ghostly pale beneath streaks of dirt and ash. Some wept openly, while others moved with mechanical efficiency, gathering supplies or tending to the injured. Nia found a woman leaning against a section of fuselage, cradling a bleeding arm. Her dark eyes were sharp, her jaw set with defiance. "Help?" Nia asked. "I've got it," the woman snapped, tightening her improvised sling. "Harper Lynn, journalist." "You?" "Nia Carter, wilderness guide." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Guess we'll need your expertise then." Farther along, Nia came across a younger woman hunched over a pile of wires and shattered plastic. Her hands were moving frantically, her face a mask of determination. "Hey," Nia said. The woman didn't look up. "I'm trying to salvage the radio. If I can get this transmitter working." "Name?" "Syra," she muttered. "Syra Rami." Nia nodded, impressed despite herself. By the time the sun began to set, the survivors had clustered around a clearing near the wreckage. There were 10 of them, but only 5 seemed capable of contributing to the group's survival. Nia stood at the center, surveying the motley crew. "We need shelter," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "Food, water, a fire, and someone needs to keep watch tonight." Mateo Alvarez, a muscular man with a military bearing, stepped forward. His eyes were shadowed, his expression unreadable. "I'll take first watch." Harper smirked. "Of course you will. Playing the hero already?" Mateo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Enough," Nia snapped. "We don't have time for this. If we don't work together, we're dead. Understand?" The group murmured their reluctant assent. As darkness fell, the jungle came alive. Insects chirped and buzzed, a rhythmic hum underscored by the distant howl of an unknown predator. The survivors huddled close to the flickering fire, their faces illuminated in its golden glow. "We'll figure this out," Nia said, more to herself than anyone else. But the wilderness loomed just beyond the firelight, vast and implacable. And deep in the shadows, something watched. The jungle was an unrelenting adversary. Each step forward felt like a battle, the group pushing through dense foliage that seemed to grow thicker with every passing hour. Nia Carter led the way, her machete slicing through the undergrowth with precise, rhythmic motions. Sweat trickled down her temples, but she pressed on, ignoring the burning in her arms. Behind her, the others followed in a loose, uneven line. The heat was suffocating, clinging to their skin and sapping their energy. Insects buzzed incessantly around their heads, drawn to the salty tang of sweat and blood. "We should stop," Owen said, his voice breaking the tense silence. He stumbled slightly, using a tree trunk to steady himself. "We need water. And where exactly do you suggest we find it?" Harper snapped, her tone laced with irritation. She swatted at a mosquito on her neck, leaving a streak of blood on her already dirt-smeared skin. "Enough," Nia said, turning to face them. Her voice carried an edge of authority that silenced any further arguments. "We'll keep moving until we find a water source. Complaining isn't going to make it appear." Owen's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Syra, the youngest of the group, hesitated before speaking. "I saw moss on the trees back there," she said quietly. "Doesn't that mean water's nearby?" Nia regarded her with a nod of approval. "It can. Good observation." She gestured to the group. "We'll head that way. Keep your eyes open." The hours that followed were grueling. The group pushed through the dense jungle, the sound of their labored breathing mingling with the cacophony of the wilderness. Nia's pace was steady, but every so often she glanced back to ensure the others were keeping up. Harper muttered under her breath, though her words were mostly lost in the hum of insects and the rustling of leaves. Mateo, bringing up the rear, moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed almost unnatural. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he had salvaged from the wreckage. Finally, the faint sound of rushing water reached their ears. Relief washed over the group like a cool breeze. They quickened their pace, emerging into a small clearing where a narrow stream wound its way through the jungle. Nia knelt by the stream, cupping the cool water in her hands before bringing it to her lips. The others watched her, hesitant. "It's safe?" Owen asked. "It's not ideal," Nia admitted. "We'll need to boil it first to be sure, but it's better than dehydration." Mateo was already gathering dry wood for a fire, his movements methodical. Harper sat down heavily on a fallen log, pulling a notebook from her bag. She began scribbling furiously, her pen scratching against the paper. "What are you doing?" Mateo asked, his voice low but curious. "Documenting," she replied without looking up. "If we get out of here, someone's going to want to know what happened. And if we don't?" She paused, her pen hovering over the page. "Then at least someone might find this." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group huddled around the crackling fire. The golden light cast flickering shadows across their faces, highlighting the lines of exhaustion etched into their features. Nia divided the tasks. Mateo would take the first watch, with Harper and Owen alternating through the night. Syra sat apart from the group, her hands busy with a tangle of wires and broken electronics salvaged from the plane. "What are you working on?" Nia asked, crouching beside her. "A transmitter," Syra said, not looking up. "If I can get this to work, we might be able to send a signal for help." Nia studied the young woman's face, noting the tightness around her eyes and the set of her jaw. "Good work," she said quietly, "but don't push yourself too hard. We're no use to each other if we burn out." Syra nodded, though her fingers didn't stop moving. That night, the jungle came alive with sound. Insects chirped and buzzed, their rhythmic hum punctuated by the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Nia sat by the fire, her machete resting across her lap, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Can't sleep," Mateo's voice broke the stillness. She glanced up to see him approaching, his expression unreadable. "Not yet. The jungle isn't quiet. It's never quiet." He sat down across from her, his movements deliberate. "You've done this before." "Something like it," Nia replied, her tone guarded. "Guiding people through wildernesses, teaching survival skills. This is different." Mateo nodded, staring into the flames. "It always is." Nia wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. The next day dawned with oppressive humidity, the air so thick it felt like they were breathing through cloth. The group broke camp and continued their trek, the jungle closing in around them like a living entity. Midday brought their first true test. A low growl echoed through the trees, stopping them in their tracks. "What was that?" Harper whispered, her voice trembling. Nia held up a hand for silence, her ears straining. The growl came again, closer this time. Then, out of the shadows, a jaguar emerged. Its sleek, muscular body moved with predatory grace, its golden eyes fixed on the group. "Don't move," Nia whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The jaguar crouched, its tail flicking back and forth like a pendulum. Time seemed to freeze as predator and prey faced off. Then, with a guttural roar, it lunged. Mateo reacted first, thrusting a flaming branch toward the beast. The jaguar snarled, recoiling from the fire's heat, but it didn't retreat. It circled them, its movements deliberate and menacing. Nia seized the moment, grabbing the machete from where it lay at her feet. "Harper," she barked, "get everyone back." Harper hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, before scrambling to herd the others away from the confrontation. Nia stepped forward, brandishing the blade. She locked eyes with the jaguar, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The jaguar snarled once more, then turned and vanished into the jungle. The group stood in stunned silence, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "That was too close," Owen said, his voice shaking. Nia exhaled slowly, lowering the machete. "Welcome to the wild," she muttered. The encounter with the jaguar left the group shaken. Tempers flared, and the cracks in their fragile unity began to widen. Harper became increasingly irritable, her sharp tongue cutting through any attempt at conversation. Owen's nervous energy made him a constant source of tension, while Syra withdrew into herself, focusing solely on her transmitter. It was Mateo who finally snapped. "Stop it!" he shouted, slamming a fist into a tree. "We're not going to survive if we keep acting like this. And what do you suggest?" Harper shot back, her arms crossed. "Hold hands and sing campfire songs?" Mateo took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You want to get out of here alive? Start pulling your weight. This isn't a vacation." "Enough!" Nia's voice cut through the argument like a whip. She stepped between them, her gaze fierce. "We don't have the luxury of fighting each other. Focus on the real threats or we're all dead." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Slowly, the group fell into an uneasy silence. The next day brought an unsettling revelation. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, Owen stopped abruptly, crouching near a tree. "What is it?" Nia asked, approaching cautiously. Owen brushed aside the moss, revealing a small metal plate embedded in the trunk. "It's a sensor," he said, his brow furrowing. The others gathered around, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. "Why would there be sensors out here?" Syra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's been here," Mateo said grimly, "and they didn't want to be found." The realization sent a ripple of unease through the group. The jungle was no longer just a force of nature. It was a place of secrets, and secrets, Nia knew, were often more dangerous than any predator. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the canopy, followed by the sharp crack of lightning that illuminated the dense foliage in blinding white. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the ground beneath their feet into a treacherous mix of mud and roots. "Keep moving," Nia shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. Her machete sliced through the vines with frantic precision, but the jungle seemed to fight back, the vegetation tightening around them like a snare. "We need to stop," Owen yelled, slipping as the mud gave way beneath him. He caught himself on a low branch, gasping. "We can't keep going in this. We can't stay here either," Nia countered, glancing over her shoulder. "The storm will flood the lower ground. We need higher ground now." Lightning forked again, closer this time, and the boom of thunder seemed to shake the earth. The group pressed on, their faces pale and strained. The rain drenched them, chilling them to the bone. As the storm raged, the group's fragile unity began to crumble. Harper stumbled over a root and let out a sharp cry of frustration. "This is insane," she snapped, throwing up her hands. "We're wandering blindly in a jungle that's trying to kill us. We're going to die out here." "No one's dying," Mateo said, his voice low and firm. "And you're so sure of that, soldier boy?" Harper shot back, her eyes flashing. "Enough!" Nia's shout cut through the argument like a whip. "We don't have time for this." But Harper wasn't finished. "No, let's hear him out. What's the plan, Mateo? Are you going to save us all with your hero complex?" Mateo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and continued up the incline, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Harper," Nia said, her voice softer now but no less firm, "I need you to pull it together." Harper's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, the fire in her eyes dimmed. "Fine," she muttered, trudging after the group. By nightfall, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered some shelter from the storm. The overhang provided a meager reprieve from the relentless rain, and the group huddled beneath it, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. "We can't stay here long," Mateo said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "It's not safe. We'll rest until the storm eases," Nia replied, her tone brooking no argument. Syra pulled out the transmitter she had been working on, shielding it from the rain with her body. Her fingers worked quickly, tightening wires and adjusting the fragile circuitry. "What's the range on that thing?" Owen asked, crouching beside her. "Not great," Syra admitted, "but if I can get a signal through, even a weak one, it might be enough." "Let's hope it is," Owen muttered. As the group settled in, a low growl echoed through the jungle. Nia's head snapped up, her hand instinctively reaching for her machete. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The growl came again, closer this time. Mateo was already on his feet, his knife drawn. The others exchanged fearful glances, their exhaustion giving way to heightened alertness. "We're not alone," Mateo said grimly. The growl turned into a snarl, and then the shadows beyond the firelight shifted. A massive shape emerged, a jaguar, its golden eyes gleaming with predatory intent. But this was no ordinary predator. Its movements were strange, almost mechanical, and as it stepped closer, the glint of metal became visible along its flank. "What the—" Harper began, but her words were cut off as the jaguar lunged. Chaos erupted. The jaguar's claws raked across the ground, narrowly missing Nia as she dove out of its path. Mateo charged forward, his knife slashing at the beast, but the blade skidded off the metallic plating on its side. "It's augmented," Owen shouted, his voice rising in panic. "What does that mean?" Harper yelled, scrambling backward. "It's been modified, experimented on." Owen's explanation was cut short as the jaguar roared, its eyes locking onto him. Syra grabbed a burning branch from the fire and waved it frantically, trying to deter the predator. The jaguar hesitated, its gaze flicking between her and the others, before pouncing. Mateo threw himself in its path, the impact driving him to the ground. He grappled with the beast, his muscles straining as he fought to keep its snapping jaws away from his throat. "Help him!" Nia screamed, her machete flashing as she charged forward. The fight was brutal and chaotic. The jaguar's strength was otherworldly, its movements a terrifying blend of animal instinct and mechanical precision. Nia's machete found purchase in its shoulder, and the beast let out a guttural roar, thrashing wildly. Mateo used the distraction to drive his knife into its exposed underbelly, the blade piercing flesh with a sickening squelch. The jaguar howled, its body convulsing before it collapsed, its glowing eyes dimming as it took its final breath. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood that pooled beneath the predator's body. "What the hell was that?" Harper demanded, her voice trembling. "It wasn't natural," Owen said, his eyes wide with shock. "Someone did this." Nia's gaze hardened. "And they're watching us." The next morning, as the storm began to subside, the group examined the jaguar's body. Beneath its matted fur, Metallic implants and wires were visible, a grotesque melding of technology and nature. "This wasn't an accident," Syra said, her voice shaking. "Someone created this thing." "But why?" Harper asked, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Why would anyone do this?" "To weaponize it," Mateo said darkly. "To control the jungle." Owen shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere?" Nia straightened, her expression grim. "We need to find out. If someone's experimenting with the wildlife, there could be more of these things out there. We're not safe until we know what we're dealing with." As the group moved on, they began to notice strange signs in the jungle. Trees marked with symbols, unnatural clearings, and more sensors hidden in the undergrowth. Syra's transmitter finally picked up a weak signal, a garbled series of numbers that sent a chill through the group. "It's a code," she said, her fingers flying over the device. "But I don't know what it means yet." "Decode it while we move," Nia said, her eyes scanning the jungle. The group's pace quickened, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Every sound in the jungle felt like a threat, every shadow a potential enemy. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing unlike any they had seen before. At its center stood a small, weathered structure, half hidden by vines and moss. It was made of metal and concrete, its design stark and utilitarian. "What is this?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A lab," Mateo said grimly. "Or what's left of one." The group approached cautiously, their weapons drawn. The air around the structure was unnaturally still, as though the jungle itself was holding its breath. Inside, the walls were lined with monitors and equipment, much of it smashed or rusted beyond use. Papers were scattered across the floor, their edges charred. Owen picked up one of the papers, his eyes scanning the text. "It's a research log," he said. "They were studying the effects of augmentations on predators, trying to enhance their abilities." "For what?" Harper asked, her voice shaking. "Control," Mateo said. "Weapons." Nia's gaze darkened. Whoever was running this place didn't care about the consequences. They've turned the jungle into a battlefield. As they searched the lab, Syra worked on decoding the signal. Her face lit up as the final piece clicked into place. "It's coordinates," she said, holding up the transmitter. "There's another site nearby." "Do we go?" Harper asked, her voice tinged with fear. Nia nodded. "We have to. If there are more of those creatures out there, we need to know what we're up against." As the group prepared to leave the lab, a low growl echoed from the jungle. Nia tightened her grip on the machete, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway. "We move now," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Stay close and stay alert." One by one, they stepped into the jungle, the shadows swallowing them whole. And as they disappeared into the depths of the wilderness, the jungle seemed to come alive once more, its unseen eyes watching their every move. The jungle seemed to pulse with a life of its own as the group moved cautiously toward the coordinates Syra had decoded. The heavy canopy above cast dappled shadows across the forest floor, the interplay of light and darkness mirroring the unease within the group. Nia led the way, her machete in hand, every sense on high alert. The events of the past days had sharpened her instincts to a razor's edge. Behind her, the others followed in tense silence, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and dragging steps. "Do you think there are more of those things out here?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no thinking about it," Mateo replied grimly. "There are." His certainty sent a chill through the group. The coordinates led them to another clearing, this one dominated by a series of low, bunker-like structures half buried in the earth. The buildings were weathered and overgrown, vines snaking their way through cracks in the concrete. "This is it," Syra said, clutching her transmitter tightly. Nia gestured for the group to spread out, her voice low but firm. "Check the perimeter. Look for anything that might tell us what's going on here." As they moved through the clearing, Owen stumbled upon a metal hatch partially concealed by foliage. He waved the others over, his excitement tempered by apprehension. Looks like an entrance, he said. Let's see what they were hiding, Nia said, her tone steely. The hatch opened with a groan, revealing a rusted ladder descending into darkness. One by one, they climbed down, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of old machinery. The corridor at the bottom of the ladder was narrow and lined with pipes that hissed occasionally, as though the place still breathed. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing faintly. "This feels like a tomb," Harper muttered, her voice tinged with unease. "It might as well be," Mateo replied, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The corridor opened into a large room filled with rows of monitors, glass cages, and surgical equipment. Papers were scattered across desks, many of them bearing diagrams of animal anatomy overlaid with mechanical components. "Oh my God," Syra whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "This is where they did it." Nia picked up a folder from one of the desks and flipped through it. The pages detailed experiments on jungle predators, with notes on behavioral modification and combat optimization. "They weren't just experimenting on animals," she said, her voice tight. "They were weaponizing them." Owen examined one of the glass cages, his expression grim. "These were living creatures. They didn't deserve this." "No one does," Mateo said, his tone cold. As they explored further, Syra worked on accessing the facility's computer system. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm in," she said after a few minutes. "There's a log here. Last entry was 6 months ago." "What does it say?" Harper asked, leaning in. Syra's eyes scanned the screen, her face growing pale. "They had to abandon the facility. Something went wrong with the augmentations. The creatures became uncontrollable." "Uncontrollable how?" Nia pressed. Syra hesitated before replying. "They turned on their creators." A sound echoed from deeper within the facility, a faint, rhythmic tapping. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the source. "Did you hear that?" Owen whispered. "Stay close," Nia said, gripping her machete tightly. They followed the sound to a small, dimly lit room. Inside, a man sat slumped against the wall, his face gaunt and hollow. He was surrounded by empty food wrappers and medical supplies, his clothing ragged and stained. "Who are you?" Nia asked, her voice firm but not unkind. The man looked up, his eyes sunken but sharp. "Dr. Isaac Klein," he rasped. "You shouldn't be here." "We didn't have much of a choice," Harper said, crossing her arms. "Care to explain what this place is?" Dr. Klein let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake," he said. "A monument to human arrogance." As Dr. Klein spoke, the story of the facility unfolded. "We were hired by a private contractor," he began, his voice weak but steady. "They wanted to create the ultimate predator, something that could be controlled, deployed, and weaponized. We used the jungle's apex predators as our subjects, jaguars, crocodiles, even birds of prey. And it went wrong," Mateo said, his tone accusatory. Dr. Klein nodded. "The augmentations worked, but the side effects were catastrophic. The animals became more aggressive, more intelligent. They turned on us. Most of the team didn't make it out." "Why didn't you leave?" Owen asked. Dr. Klein's gaze dropped. "I couldn't. I thought I could fix it, but I was wrong. Now I'm trapped here, waiting for the jungle to finish what it started." Nia exchanged a glance with Mateo. "We can't leave him here," she said quietly. "You want to bring him with us?" Harper asked, incredulous. "He's part of the reason we're in this mess." "He's also the only one who knows what we're dealing with," Nia countered. Dr. Klein raised a hand. "I won't slow you down," he said. "But if you're leaving, take this." He handed Nia a small, data-filled drive. "It has everything. The experiments, the failures, the dangers. Get it to someone who can stop this from happening again." Nia hesitated, then nodded. The jungle seemed to pulse with a life of its own as the group moved cautiously toward the coordinates Syra had decoded. The heavy canopy above cast dappled shadows across the forest floor, the interplay of light and darkness mirroring the unease within the group. Nia led the way, her machete in hand, every sense on high alert. The events of the past days had sharpened her instincts to a razor's edge. Behind her, the others followed in tense silence, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and dragging steps. "Do you think there are more of those things out here?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no thinking about it," Mateo replied grimly. "There are." His certainty sent a chill through the group. The coordinates led them to another clearing, this one dominated by a series of low, bunker-like structures half buried in the earth. The buildings were weathered and overgrown, vines snaking their way through cracks in the concrete. "This is it," Syra said, clutching her transmitter tightly. Nia gestured for the group to spread out, her voice low but firm. "Check the perimeter. Look for anything that might tell us what's going on here." As they moved through the clearing, Owen stumbled upon a metal hatch partially concealed by foliage. He waved the others over, his excitement tempered by apprehension. "Looks like an entrance," he said. "Let's see what they were hiding," Nia said, her tone steely. The hatch opened with a groan, revealing a rusted ladder descending into darkness. One by one, they climbed down, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of old machinery. The corridor at the bottom of the ladder was narrow and lined with pipes that hissed occasionally, as though the place still breathed. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing faintly. "This feels like a tomb," Harper muttered, her voice tinged with unease. "It might as well be," Mateo replied, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The corridor opened into a large room filled with rows of monitors, glass cages, and surgical equipment. Papers were scattered across desks, many of them bearing diagrams of animal anatomy overlaid with mechanical components. "Oh my God," Syra whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "This is where they did it." Nia picked up a folder from one of the desks and flipped through it. The pages detailed experiments on jungle predators, with notes on behavioral modification and combat optimization. "They weren't just experimenting on animals," she said, her voice tight. "They were weaponizing them." Owen examined one of the glass cages, his expression grim. "These were living creatures. They didn't deserve this." "No one does," Mateo said, his tone cold. The group stood at the edge of the jungle, the vast expanse of green stretching endlessly behind them. The ridge they had reached offered a brief reprieve, a place to catch their breath and gather their thoughts. But the ordeal had left its mark on each of them, their faces etched with exhaustion and haunted by the memories of what they had endured. Nia crouched near the edge, staring at the horizon. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the horrors hidden within the jungle's depths. Her machete rested against her knee, its blade nicked and stained, a testament to the battles they had fought. Mateo approached, his movements deliberate but slow. A makeshift bandage was wrapped around his arm, blood seeping through the fabric. "We need to move soon," he said, his voice low. "We don't know if more of those things are coming." Nia nodded but didn't look up. "I know." Harper paced a short distance away, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She had written furiously during their brief stops, documenting everything: the augmented predators, the experiments, the facility, and Dr. Klein's confession. "This story is going to blow everything wide open," she said, her voice tinged with both determination and disbelief. "If we get out of here alive." Owen sat nearby, his hands wrapped around his knees. He had barely spoken since they left the facility, his eyes distant. "Even if people believe us, what can they do?" he asked. "The jungle's already out of control." Syra, cradling the data drive like a fragile artifact, chimed in. "They have to believe us. This drive has everything: proof of the experiments, the failures, the risks. If we can get it to the right people—" She trailed off, her voice trembling. "We will," Nia said, standing. Her voice carried a quiet authority that silenced any doubts. "We've come too far to let this die out here." Dr. Klein sat apart from the group, leaning against a tree. His face was pale and his breathing shallow. The journey had taken a toll on him, and his body bore the evidence of years spent in isolation and guilt. "You don't have to stay here," Nia said, crouching beside him. Klein shook his head weakly. "I won't make it," he said, "and even if I could, I don't deserve to leave." "You gave us the drive," Nia replied. "That has to count for something." Klein let out a bitter laugh. "I'm the reason that drive exists. I'm the reason those creatures exist. My hands aren't clean, Nia." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and resignation. "But yours are. Get them out of here. Make this mean something." Nia didn't argue. She stood and nodded once, a silent promise. The ridge gave way to a narrow trail that snaked down toward flatter terrain. The group moved cautiously, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sending their nerves into overdrive. But the jungle, though still alive with sound, seemed to be retreating, as though acknowledging their resolve to escape. "Do you think it's over?" Harper asked, glancing at Nia. "No," Nia said, her voice firm, "but it's a start." The trail eventually led them to a riverbank where the remains of a crude dock stood. A small, battered boat was moored there, its engine rusted but intact. "Do you think it'll run?" Syra asked, skepticism evident in her tone. Mateo inspected the engine, tinkering with the wires and pulling the cord to test the motor. Sputtered once, then roared to life. "That's our ride," he said, wiping grease from his hands. The boat carried them down the river, its engine loud and jarring against the natural symphony of the jungle. The current was swift, the water dark and reflective. Nia kept her eyes on the riverbanks, her machete within reach. No one spoke. The weight of their journey pressed down on them, unspoken but palpable. As the river widened, the oppressive canopy began to thin, and the sun shone brighter. It was a subtle shift, but it brought with it a sense of relief. "We're almost out," Owen said, his voice barely audible. The boat rounded a bend, and in the distance, they saw a small settlement, a cluster of buildings surrounded by farmland, smoke curling from chimneys. Harper let out a shaky laugh, her first genuine smile in days. "We made it," she said, tears welling in her eyes. The group disembarked, their feet unsteady on solid ground. Villagers approached cautiously, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "We need to contact the authorities," Nia said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "And we need medical attention." As the villagers led them toward shelter, Nia glanced back at the jungle. Its dark expanse seemed almost peaceful from this distance, but she knew better. "That place changes you," Mateo said, stepping beside her. "It changes everyone," Nia replied. Days later, cleaned up but still carrying the scars of their ordeal, the group sat in a small office, waiting to meet with government officials. Harper's notebook lay open on her lap, and Syra held the data drive tightly. "This is it," Harper said, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. "The truth comes out today." "And then what?" Owen asked. "What happens after they know?" Nia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We let them decide, but we've done our part." As the sun rose over the small village, the jungle loomed in the distance, a vast, enigmatic presence that seemed both threatening and eternal. Nia stood at the edge of the village, watching the treetops sway gently in the breeze. Mateo joined her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. "No," Nia said after a moment, "but it's a start."